Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University.
Welcome to the Politics Guys, the podcast for an in-depth, bipartisan weekly policy analysis of the news. I'm Trey Orndorff, and this week I'm joined by Michael Baranowski. How are you doing this week, Mike?
I'm doing okay, Trey. How about you?
Well, it's a new year. It's 2018, so I'm doing phenomenal because I haven't screwed it up yet.
Well, yeah. There's still a lot of year to go, so I have faith in myself. I have faith in you too, actually, Trey. I think it's going to be a great year.
I agree. And I think the other thing that's going to be kind of exciting is to see what we do here in the Politics Guys for the upcoming 2018 year. I'm pretty excited about what we have planned and what we're going to be doing, and I know you are too. And so I hope that listeners, you're willing to take a look at us in 2018 as well.
Absolutely. A lot of big stuff going on, big elections that I'm very much looking forward to, and, well, all kinds of other stuff.
Well, you and all of your leftist colleagues are probably waiting for the future, but we'll see what happens. You never know. I mean, it might be the year that Trump turns it around, and no, I mean, it's 2018. It's not an alternative future timeline, but be that as it may. This week, there's a lot of big news that we want to get into, and so let's head into our some of our analysis, and let's start with Korea. If listeners don't know, there were some really surprising things happening while the holiday was going on. Kim Jong-un, in his New Year's address, made overtures that he'd be willing to have talks with South Korea, and this is a really big deal because the two countries have been at a complete standstill for at least 2 years. As a matter of fact, there is a primary phone line between the North and the South for quick conversations and issues that has not been used in more than 2 years. So Kim Jong-un's overtures were, a lot of people wondered what was going to happen with this. Well, as a matter what is happening with this is that there are going to be talks in the demilitarization zone on January 9th in just a couple of days. And the two big items on the agenda are improving inter-Korean relationships and the upcoming Olympic Games. So there's a lot of questions here about what's happening. One possibility is this is due to the missile tests, that Kim Jong-un feels a little bit more secure. Or in the words of Defense Secretary Mattis, that is this a real olive branch or a one-off? Donald Trump, of course, weighed in on January 4th, and he argued that the experts were all wrong, that none of the, quote, talks and dialogues would be going on between North and South right now if I wasn't firm, strong, and willing to commit our total might against the North. Fools, but talks are a good thing. So, we do know the annual military drills are postponed, Michael. So what do you think about this? What's the setup here? Because we have spent a lot of time talking about what's happening and what's the proper thing to happen. And I think the last time we chatted about this, we both, from differing perspectives, says we didn't see a positive outcome. Well, this is about as positive as one could hope in the current circumstances. What do you think?
Well, I guess I'll start with the negative. How about that?
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah, well, and then move to positive. On the negative, I don't think there are going to be any sort of talks that result in North Korea giving up their nuclear program. I think North Korea wouldn't have done that in any event, but they learned the lesson from what happened when Libya gave up their nuclear weapons and, Gaddafi ended up, dead. And so that's not going to happen. That's not going to be an outcome, even though the stated policy of the United States under Trump, under Obama, under previous presidents has been, we will not allow them to get these weapons. They're going to get these weapons that are going to be able to, increasingly hit more parts of the United States and be more accurate. And I don't think there's a whole heck of a lot we're going to be able to do about that. Now, that's the negative, and that's obviously pretty negative, right?
Yeah.
But I think the positive is, the sanctions, I think, seem to be biting a little bit. I don't think absent these sanctions that North Korea would be making these overtures. And, the question to me is, would this have happened under another president? President Trump is taking credit for it, for taking a hard line and pushing. And I think that's not an unreasonable position to take. And that's, that is a fairly reasonable position. It's weird for me to say that because so many of the positions, at least in terms of foreign policy, I think President Trump has taken have been unreasonable and irrational. But I think he might have a point here. But the question in my mind is, well, had North Korea been pursuing this path and had there been another president, and North Korea certainly would have been pursuing this path, would this sort of thing would have happened? I don't know. It's sort of difficult to answer that hypothetical, but I don't know. I think President Trump might be onto something here.
That's fascinating. One of the things that's always difficult about this is when you're attempting to get at those counterfactuals, right?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
so what are the variables that actually lead that to happening? And I think on this one we're probably going to be in agreement. I might take a little bit harder line of the economic agreement. I know a little bit later we're going to talk about Iran. I think that it's economic conditions that oftentimes force political leaders, especially in closed regimes, to make opening moves because eventually you just can't continue forward. But then you come to the same question that you're encountering, which is how much of this is already in motion and how much of this is what's happening in a year. And it's really difficult to disentangle that. But once again, I'll have to agree with you. I don't think that anyone could say that Donald Trump was not a reason for this to be able to come forward. If that's a
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it almost feels like I know there are some people who are a lot more sympathetic to President Trump who listen to the show, and I was thinking it almost sounds like I'm kind of falling over backwards to not give Donald Trump any credit, and so maybe that's just sort of a bias or reflex that I have, and so I just want to state fairly clearly that I think that taking a harder line maybe is the way to go, and that idea that we've tried a different approach for so long and it really hasn't resulted in anything, I think there's something to be said for that. On the other hand, I'm concerned about irresponsible and needlessly inflammatory comments like, tell him that I have a bigger nuclear button on my desk and it works. I don't see the point of that exactly. So that's kind of the other side of it, I think.
Well, and I think the other part that goes along with that is that we're trying to discount the amount that throwing out a few tweets is what makes a policy harder or more firm than your systematic policy against a country. And I think that's where it can be difficult for people. When you're just taking a look at the news, remember that it's not the one-off tweets that's going to have the impact on Kim Jong-un. It's going to be the things that you do policy-wise, economic policy, military policy, etc. And it can be, I think, it can be difficult for even the close observer of the news to disentangle the rhetoric from the things the variables that actually matter.
Sure. So the tweets might upset Kim Jong Un, but the idea that oil shipments are being curtailed dramatically is something that really has some kind of bite.
Precisely,
Yeah,
precisely.
I think you're absolutely right about that. Definitely. So, I was thinking before we move on to Iran, maybe we should thank our first sponsor, actually our only sponsor for today, and that is Policy Genius. Let me ask you a question, Trey. Did you know that every new year, nearly a third of people resolve to be more financially responsible? I mean, that's a lot, right? And guess what happens with most of those resolutions?
Well, it's probably going to be like my sister-in-law. What? They fail. Oh, wait. Did I
Eh,
say that in the air? No.
exactly. Well, I mean, that's what happens with most resolutions. I've already failed with I had 5 and I failed with 3 of them. I still have a couple going strong here in January 6th. But anyway, here's I guess the genius part of Policy Genius is they can help you make the smart, responsible financial decision to buy life insurance in as little as 5 minutes. Because with Policy Genius, you can compare quotes online to get the best policy at, the best price for you. They've helped over 4 million people, and they don't just insure life, they insure everything that goes in it. You can compare quotes for health insurance, disability insurance, renter's insurance, even pet insurance. And hey, that's important. We have 4 dogs. It's an important thing. Anyway, so if you made a New Year's resolution to be better with money, or even if you didn't, you can do that at policygenius.com. It is the easy way to compare and buy life insurance. There's absolutely zero sales pressure and no hassle, and it's free. And, free is the most financially responsible price. Policy Genius. Get your New Year's resolution resolved in 5 minutes. Okay, so Trey, you said we're going to move on to, is it Iran, right?
Yes, Iran. As a matter of fact, we have some really interesting Iran news going on. We've got what appears to be some major sustained protest occurring in Iran. And as a matter of fact, the reason this is such a big deal is this has not happened since 2009. 2009 is the last time we've had some major protests in Iran. And as a matter of fact, the 2009 protests, myself included, argued that the timing was due to the widespread dissemination of social media, and this allowed the ability to coordinate action. The State Department agreed and asked Twitter to delay scheduled updates in 2009 to ensure that the distribution of information by protesters would not be disrupted. And so now here we are in 2018, and we're facing the same question, which is why now? What's brought this forward? So let's get a little bit of context here. On December 28th, the protest will break out and will be spurred by the high prices of some basic goods, which had raised about 40%. Over the next week, the protests would spread and turn into an outright open rebellion. According to the New York Times, Iranian authorities, learning this time from 2009, would block access to social media and messaging apps. Khamenei is arguing that the country's enemies are the ones who are bringing on the protesters. Big surprise. The violence has been pretty much downplayed internally. Some analysts have been quick to hint, I would say too quick to hint, that this might be the end of the regime. But I think those are oftentimes short-sighted. Right now, the protests have been dwindling, but that still doesn't mean that there won't be effects from it or that it's not continuing it on. I'll say that the Nation kind of had an interesting argument and argued that it was a combination of a lack of investment because people are worried about what's happening in Iran, in conjunction with the release of the government's 2018 budget, which is actually going to be a big slashing budget on subsidies for goods and fuel, which is what created the 2018 protests. But it's still an open question. It's still fascinating why it's happening now. And obviously, there's a lot of disagreement about what the outcome will be. So, Michael, what do you think's happening here? Why now, and what's going to happen?
Well, I think it goes back to something you said about the Korea situation, where these economic factors are hugely important. And sometimes I think they're really underreported. I think a part of the reason why the Iranian government came to the table and was able to work out a nuclear deal with the Obama administration is those sanctions were really hurting them. And they hoped, I think, that lifting those sanctions would help their economy, but it really hasn't nearly as much as they would have hoped. And they've got some serious problems in their economy. Half the country is under 30, and unemployment for younger workers is somewhere between 20 and 40%. We don't have really good, stats on that because it's not exactly an open society. And so, I mean, to me, again, it's an economic issue, and that's the kind of thing that brings people to talks and maybe gets people to consider becoming a better player in the community of nations. And I guess from the domestic politics side of things, which is how I approach all of this, is I think the United States needs to ask what our goal is here. President Trump is an American first sort of guy. And so what's the sort of goal that would be best for the United States? And I would think that the goal that would be best for the United States is first and foremost to do nothing to harm the protest movement, because obviously we want to see change in Iran. We'd like to see peaceful change in Iran, ideally. And one thing we know is that America is broadly hated in Iran. And so I got to wonder if, kind of strong, open, vocal support for protests, especially from a president who, rightly or wrongly, much of the world views as very anti-Muslim, if that's going to help or hurt the situation. And I think you can make a good case that, that's going to hurt the situation. And so, I think we have this bias to do something, but sometimes the best thing you can do is just sit back and let things happen and not screw it up.
No, that is definitely the case. And as a matter of fact, on this front, Trump's lack of getting too deeply involved, I think, has been a positive. And it's actually, I know, again, this is going to maybe frustrate some people who didn't like the previous president. That's more or less the track that President Obama took in 2008. In 2009, the kind of hands-off, let's allow this, yes, we are concerned about what's happening, kind of just a broad but neutral statement about what's going on. And I think you're right, Michael, that it can be difficult. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons, I'm a libertarian conservative is that I think that the economic variables are often the most important variables that influence the political outcomes. but they're slow moving. And you're right. The best thing you can often do is to say, give these things time to percolate.
Yeah. But that's so against our natural inclinations, especially in modern politics, that well, we have to do something to help the situation along. And it's difficult to avoid that, I think.
Well, and in addition to just being against our inclination politically, I think it's against our inclination as kind of modern, uh, I shouldn't even not modern, but contemporary minded individuals and humans. I think we tend to think in minutes and moments because of the way that we analyze and are disseminating information. And so the idea of waiting a week seems an eternity, let alone longer than that. As a matter of fact, you were talking about for the ad New Year's resolutions, and one of the things that kills people is their inability to have patience when it comes to long-term changes, right? You
Hmm.
don't lose all of the weight tomorrow. You might lose half a pound, over a course of a month. And I think the same thing holds true here. We're always looking for that next thing that's going to drive the narrative forward, but that's not always the
Absolutely.
best outcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that if there's nothing else to be said about Iran, that we might want to turn domestic after taking a look at Korea and Iran and talk about the Department of Justice. This week, the DOJ moved to return to the rule of law on Thursday, quote unquote, by resigning some Obama era guidance that allowed legal marijuana to thrive in certain states that had made it legal, according to The Hill. What does that mean, listeners? It means that under Obama, there was a DOJ memo that essentially told federal attorneys not to prioritize prosecuting marijuana cases in states that had already made that legal. The memo on Thursday from Sessions directs the U.S. attorneys to enforce the Controlled Substances Acts uniformly. In other words, don't pay attention to whether a state is quote unquote legalized a controlled substance. This is a particularly big deal that given that 6 states, most recently California on January 1st, have legalized it in some fashion, in some places outright, just like in California. The weed industry itself doesn't seem phased, according to a number of publications, including Wired. Lawyers for the weed industry are arguing that the attorney generals are not going to want to go against state government laws, but here is still this push from Sessions to make it happen. And so we're left with a pretty big change in policy from the DOJ and a number of states living in a weird equilibrium where they're basically doing things that are illegal at the federal level. And while this has always been true, they've been given a little bit of wiggle room on this front in the past from the Obama administration. And it seems the Trump administration says, no, we're not going to allow states to have a state by state case basis on marijuana. So this brings up all kinds of interesting policy analysis, Michael. So what do you think about this?
Well, I guess the first thing I think is that Jeff Sessions is on the wrong side of history on a lot of issues, and this is one of them. Almost 70% of Americans are in favor of some type of marijuana legalization. 29 states have some sort of legalized marijuana. There are probably half a dozen or so more that are likely to add to that in 2018. It generates a lot of money, up to by 2020, some estimates say it's likely to generate up to $2.5 billion in state tax revenue. And so this is going to happen, I think, no matter what. And I think Jeff Sessions has a mindset back from the 1980s and the 1990s. He's an old guy, and I think he has views that were very mainstream back in, like I said, the 80s and the 90s. But clearly, a lot of folks don't, and that's not just Democrats. That's also Republicans. Cory Gardner said he's going to be putting hold on every single DOJ nomination until Jeff Sessions allows the state of Colorado to have, well, states' rights to decide this thing on their own. And that's an interesting aspect of it too. We think of the Republican Party as the party behind, let's not be dictated to by big government in Washington, D.C., and let the states decide. And yet here we have big government in Washington, D.C. dictating to states what they can and, can't, or trying to get in the way at least. And so I think that actually, in a way, Jeff Sessions might be doing the marijuana movement a favor, and he'd probably kill him to think that. But Right now, obviously, federal law has marijuana as a Schedule One substance, which means it can't be subscribed or prescribed. It's very difficult to do studies with, and other things as well. And there's legislation that's been introduced in the House, the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act, that has actually bipartisan support. I believe it has like a little more than a dozen co-sponsors. And well, this is the kind of thing that I think we're going to see get more and more support in the future. And if the DOJ takes a hard line and does decide to kind of go forward with more prosecutions, more very, I think, ill-advised prosecutions, I think that's going to actually help out this movement. So Sessions may actually be shooting himself in the foot here.
I agree in half. I think that you're right that Sessions is definitely going to make the need to have a uniform policy a bigger deal, put it on the front burner of Congress's activity. But this is an example of where I find problems with the Republicans and the Democrats, because I uniformly think that you often have local policy is better policy. But Republicans and Democrats, they always use this as a bludgeon, in my opinion, for the issues that they're most interested in, right? So if you happen to be on the side of what the national government's going to do, then you're going to say, well, we need to have nationalization. If you're on the side of the local. And the problem is that we have allowed this law to exist in conflict and have not resolved in a major way what this means. It is time, I would argue that it is time. This shows an example of where marijuana, you're on the right, you were talking about the right side of history, and what you're talking is the popular side of history. And while I agree with that movement that we need to have legalization of marijuana, it is time to stop having the federal government have controlled substances. Period. Let states deal with that themselves. And then we wouldn't have this complex interaction between states controlled substance with the national level. I mean, I know that makes me radical on this front, but I take this argument a little bit further. I think the problem is that we have a national government that's trying to determine what kinds of things are going to be controlled and not controlled, and that's problematic in my opinion.
No, and I certainly agree. I think that the federal government has a role in terms of interstate drug trafficking and that sort of thing. But for programs that exist completely within the bounds of one state, then that to me is not okay for the federal government to get involved with that. And so on that, I definitely agree with you.
Yeah,
But but
yeah,
I was
continue.
going to say one other point I want to make though is, in a sense though, Jeff Sessions is right by saying that, hey, here's the law, and I'm just saying to federal prosecutors that I expect you to enforce it. But and if you read his memo isn't, hey, let's go after the pot people. It's basically saying that, I mean, he starts off by saying, in deciding which marijuana activities to prosecute under these laws, with the department's finite resources, prosecutors should follow the well-established principle that govern all federal prosecutions. And so he talks about relevant considerations of the crime, the deterrent effect of criminal prosecution, and the cumulative impact of particular crimes on the community. And I think that, as you mentioned earlier, what that means on the ground level is that prosecutors are going to look at that and say, well, we've got much bigger fish to fry. We don't even know if we'd be able to get convictions on pot prosecutions from juries in these states, given that it's legal. So are we going to waste our money and time on that? No. So in a way, I think it's almost a symbolic move by Sessions saying that, hey, this is the law. I expect you to enforce it. And we're going to pull away from this sort of executive branch overreach type of thing that I think was going on in the Obama administration Department of Justice.
Yeah, and I think on that front, I'm deeply sympathetic to Sessions, right? The Obama administration was basically attempting to put a Band-Aid on a bigger issue instead of pushing in a meaningful way for a fix.
Yeah. Yeah. But I also think that we're not going to see a congressional fix because Congress isn't there yet. And I don't think Congress is even close to there yet, which seems surprising given that so many states have gone in that direction. But I don't actually think that we're going to see any sort of federal marijuana law, taking it out, that legislation I mentioned, which would remove marijuana from Schedule One and eliminate all federal penalties for anyone who's involved in state legal marijuana activity. that's not going to happen this year. That's not going to happen next year. I think that might happen in 2021 would be my best guess.
Do you think it's simply, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to guess that your reasoning for that is that it's just not high enough of a priority to spend political capital on the Hill yet?
Yeah, exactly. And I think in 2021, if things go like how I think they might go, by 2021, I think there'll be a Congress and a president that are perhaps a little more amenable to that sort of thing. And I think the environment will be a lot better for that. But that's obviously a long ways away. I do think it's inevitable, but I think it's going to be years before it actually happens.
Another good point about timing on things. Inevitability does not mean immediate.
No, absolutely.
Well, the other big domestic news, although we got a number of big domestic items, but another big domestic item was the Wolff book. And I know that we don't want to get kind of into the details of mudslinging, but there are some interesting policy things happening here. Bannon basically talked with a reporter who had been writing a book. And depending on differing accounts of this, it seems relatively likely that Wolff, the author, had been given clearance to be in the White House to interview people, even if it was not perfectly clear to President Trump himself why. But be that as it may, clearly he's able to be here. And he's interested in working on a book on the Trump presidency. And an excerpt of that book came out this week. And one of the big portions of it is Bannon basically unloading on Trump and Trump's family. And the crux of it was when he says that a Trump Tower meeting during the campaign between Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and a Russian lawyer was, quote, treasonous and, quote, unpatriotic. And another point, he's going to call Ivanka Trump, quote, dumb as a brick, end quote. And so this and other things led to the president's lawyer sending out cease and desist letters both to Bannon personally for violating a non-disclosure agreement, theoretically, and to Wolff and the publisher, arguing that they are committing libel and slander and that all of this is false. As a matter of fact, it goes so far, this isn't even just President Trump tweeting, so not only does his lawyer send out these statements, which is a big deal in and of itself, there would be a White House statement that says, quote, Steve Bannon has nothing to do with me or my presidency. Quote, when he was fired, he not only lost his job, he lost his mind. So, what's fascinating on the policy side here is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, because I've looked at this pretty deeply. This is one of my areas. I don't think there has ever been a campaign where we had these kinds of non-disparaging agreements being signed before, like you do for television. I have not at least encountered this, or if they have been, they have never been brought up. So that's kind of a fascinating one piece of it. And then to have the libel and slander argument come out, that's unusual as well. So what do you think about the approach that's happening here? And again, this is not happening on Twitter. We're talking about statements and letters from lawyers.
Well, I guess on one level, there's nothing that we don't already know here. I mean, on that level, we already knew that Donald Trump was unprepared for the job, that he is not interested in the details of policy, that he's thin-skinned, that he's narcissistic, that he's childish. I mean, this is not news, I don't think, to anyone. Also, I mean, it's not like we didn't know that Steve Bannon was kind of out there, right? But that makes total sense to me because it's hard for us maybe to remember now, but until very late in the primary, until halfway through the primary season, maybe, most people still thought that Donald Trump would not win and certainly would not become president. And so the people he attracted to his campaign were not exactly top quality elite talent type people. There were some, there was a fair number of nuts who got pulled into this, and Steve Bannon is one of those, And so I guess I'm not surprised on that level, though. I got to think, what in the world would prompt you to tell a reporter that is writing a book that the president's child is an idiot? That to me doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense.
And
Yeah. I mean, I don't quite get that. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. But in terms of the cease and desist thing, I mean that's classic Donald Trump. He's had his attorneys for decades file these things when there's something unflattering about him that's written, and I don't think that goes anywhere. But Donald Trump doesn't let any shot go unanswered, for better or for worse, even if it hurts him. And so there you go. There, I think maybe the only good thing to come out of this is that Steve Bannon's losing some support. It's mentioned that the Mercers are kind of pulling away from him and
Hmm.
and other folks. And so I think a world with a less influential Steve Bannon is, other things being equal, a better world. And so, hey, that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, I mean the facts themselves, there's not a whole lot new, and to analyze the part that fascinates me is what kinds of precedents will be set for the presidency if this continues to court. Now, I know that some of my conservative colleagues say, nah, this is never going to happen, and this is just him flaring out. However, if you look historically, when those things move forward, like the flag case with his one of his golf communities,
Hmm.
he takes these to court sometimes, and it would be, so from my point of view, the interesting thing is what might happen as the precedent. Because listeners, one of the things that I think Michael is interested in is too is when you think about the presidency, it's not just a body of law; it's a body of precedents set by previous presidents on which they can build. And so when you have new ground broken, you often wonder what will that mean? How will that be molded by future presidents? And I think that's what I think I'm interested in this because of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I would like to believe, and maybe I'm just being blind here, but I would like to believe that Donald Trump is sort of a one-off. We'll look back in 20 years and say, well, that was an odd, unfortunate aberration, and that the next president, whether it's a Republican president or a Democratic president, is going to decide, I'm going to get back to sort of business as usual in the sense of acting in a presidential way. And I like to think that that's going to be something, like I said, that either party would do. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think all of us, for the sake of the country and the dignity and the importance of the presidency, would hope that I'm right about that.
I hope you're right too, but as a presidential scholar, one of the things that you don't get rid of everything immediately and precedents that are set. I mean, Andrew
No, you're right.
Jackson,
Yeah.
you know, the famous saying when Andrew Jackson became president from his hometown was, "Well, if he can be president, anybody can be president." And I think sometimes that way about Trump. And many of his precedents did lay dormant, but not all of them. And I think it can be, again, I'm not predicting the downfall of mankind, but I do think the presidency will look different after Trump, even if the next person does everything that you suggest, Michael. But
Yeah.
we'll have to see.
Yeah, I think you're right. I just hope I just hope, and I actually think it's not going to be too dramatic, and
No.
we'll find out. Hopefully, we'll find out in January of 2021. That's my hope. So we'll see.
When the Republicans come back and go against their own nominee and we win? No.
Well, yeah, I have a little different scenario in place, but
Oh, well, for our last story today, one more domestic item, a pretty big one and a much more, probably maybe fell under the radar for many readers, was the offshore drilling changes that occurred on Thursday. On Thursday, the Trump administration said it would allow new offshore oil and gas drilling in nearly all U.S. coastal waters. The proposal would lift an Obama era ban near the end of his term, where he kind of closed that down. Finalizing the plan, of course, listeners, could take up to 18 months, assuming there are no other issues that move forward. And there are obviously some issues that are moving forward. For example, even here in my home state of Florida, I was a little shocked to learn that Rick Scott, our Florida and a big Trump supporter, was vehemently against the plan and had issued a number of statements saying that he is going to attempt to keep offshore drilling from happening in Florida, and that he is already reaching out to the White House to say, not in Florida, which is interesting. Again, not just because I live here, but because Rick Scott is a big supporter of Trump. He's exiting. He's at the end of his second term, can't run for reelection. So he is obviously staking the other side of the ground on this, although you might think that he wouldn't. So it's interesting to see what might happen with this move. What do you think, Michael?
Well, I think Rick Scott, like a lot of people in Florida, remember the Deepwater Horizon uh, rig disaster in 2010.
Hmm.
Millions of gallons of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico, 11 people killed, and there are a lot of coastal states that depend on tourism dollars, and don't exactly want the possibility of that happening, or just the unsightliness, right, of just right offshore drilling. Now, in many cases, this is a very remote possibility, especially off the Atlantic coast, because right now there's no infrastructure there. The oil prices are fairly low, and the oil companies aren't going to be doing anything anytime in the immediate future to develop that, especially given how chancy how risky the environment is. But that being said, certainly in the Gulf of Mexico, the infrastructure is already there, and that gives them the go ahead to do more. So I think Rick Scott has reason to be justly concerned about that sort of thing. But, and again, I think this is another, I wouldn't call it exactly symbolic, but it's not going to lead to rigs showing up offshore, in a month or a year or even a few years. But
No.
that's not to say I think it's a good idea. I think it's certainly not a good idea. But one thing I should point out is that the Obama administration actually was sort of on the fence about whether to sell, to open up some of these offshore leases as well before, as you pointed out, the waning days of his presidency, he issued that order. So there's a lot of pressure on both Democrats and Republicans to make these leases available. And just because an oil company, purchases this lease doesn't mean that they're going to do anything with that territory, though I think we can make a very strong environmental case that it might be better just not to give them the option.
Yeah, and the other thing that's difficult about it, you mentioned the gas prices and oil prices, and you're right. I mean, right now that's not a big deal, but I think one of the more consistent policy positions from the Trump administration, as you had noted with Iran, is the idea that you want to make sure that the United States has an America first, if you will, an internal self-reliance, and on that front, we still are impacted by foreign oil prices, and I think this probably fits pretty nicely with that view. I mean, I understand why they're doing it, and you're right to note that the Obama administration too had wrestled with it for similar reasons. It can be difficult. It's not as if tomorrow we can be off of oil, and as a result, that means that those fluctuations, even if they're not impacting you right now, aren't possibilities that long-term strategic thinkers aren't thinking about.
Right. And another thing I want to point out is, I guess I would say the conservative argument, which I have some sympathy for, would be, I think, something along the lines of, well, why don't we just let the market decide on this? Because if there's a lot of public opposition, there's a lot of opposition in the states, and there are these issues with fluctuating energy prices, well, then market forces will dictate that oil companies won't develop these leases, and that's how it should be, as opposed to the government making this decision. And I certainly am sympathetic to that, though I would be a lot more sympathetic to it if the Trump administration hadn't also recently acted to significantly lessen new safety restrictions that were put into place after the Deepwater rig disaster. And so I think if you're going to open up these leases, knowing that there is a very real possibility of oil spills that can, be environmentally incredibly hazardous, then you should at least have very strong protections in place to make sure that that's a lot less likely than it would otherwise be. But the Trump administration doesn't seem interested in doing that.
And it's fascinating that that's the order that those things happen, to be honest. Even if I was working for the administration and you said, "Look, Trey, this is what we want to do. Now implement it the best way you can." You think you would have gone the other way around.
Yeah,
And
I
had some
think so.
lag time there. I mean there's 3 more years in his term.
But I also think though that maybe since so much of this goes under the radar and it's not the kind of story that people focus on a lot, people don't really say, "Oh, so it's now a third party doesn't need to check the regulators on these drilling rigs or what have you." That's never going to be the lead story in the New York Times or wherever you're getting your news. And so I think the bet is that you have a small group of very influential people and the energy industry lobbyists who are intensely interested in this sort of thing. And so, yeah, maybe there's a story for a day or two in some lefty parts of the media, but that's all going to get just, forgotten after President Trump tweets something weird or funny about Steve Bannon or Rocket Man or something like that. And so they can go ahead and do that and not have to worry about consequences. And sadly, I think to a great extent that happens to be the case.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it. You're almost undoubtedly right about the burying of it. So, well, I think that brings us to what we've been reading, holiday edition. So, Michael, what have what have you been doing and reading on the break?
Well, what I'm recommending this week is an article from National Review, which obviously is not
National Review.
National Review. I read National Review on a regular basis. In fact, I get their daily digest and so forth. I think it's a great publication that I disagree with most of the time. But
Somewhere out in the world, Jay is raising his head and saying, "There's a disturbance in the
yeah,
force."
no kidding. But the article I'm recommending this week is something called "Post-Christian America: Can a Polarized America Survive?" And I've been fascinated by this. I'm not a religious person myself, but I've been fascinated by this idea for years of the role that religion plays in bringing a country together. And essentially, the argument of this article is that when a country doesn't have a common moral language, a common religious culture, that you start to see it kind of devolving into tribalism. And I don't necessarily agree with all the argument here, but I do think there's really something fundamentally that feels right about that argument. I don't know that it has to be religious per se or Judeo-Christian necessarily, but I think this is an important point to make. And I think a lot of folks on the left tend to just kind of take the sort of Sam Harrisy sort of view that, well, religion is awful and evil and has done more harm than good and so forth and is irrational. And even if you agree with some of those things, I think religion as a force of social cohesion is and pretty clearly important. And I think it's important for us to think seriously about what happens when that starts to go away. And so I recommend that article for that reason. So also I wanted to mention that I put up a blog post again just yesterday, or I think it came out just today, in fact, about my New Year's resolutions for the politics guys. And so I hope folks will check that out. And you can do that by just going to politicsguys.com/Mike, and you'll see it right there. And also one other thing I wanted to, before I forget, I'm hoping listeners can help me out with something. I did not too long ago, I did a short avocado politics episode. It was basically just a mini podcast episode of my blog post on that. And the response was really positive. And so I'm going to do more of them. But what I'd like to hear from listeners is when you'd like to see them drop, what day of the week, because of course we already have our show on Wednesday and our show on Saturday. And so I'm trying to figure out what day you'd like to see them, these short kind of food politics posts. And also, if you have any preference for me either keeping these as part of the politics guys, or if you'd prefer that I maybe spin off the food politics podcast as a separate show, which I could do as well. So if you could check that out and let me know what you think, that would be great.
Well, that's cool, Michael. And it's interesting for your reading. As a matter of fact, with our listeners who follow us on social media, which you can on Twitter and on Facebook, we actually, earlier in the week, I had released an article from The Atlantic. So how fascinating that I was doing The Atlantic and you were doing the review on very similar issues about religion. It was fascinating to see what our listeners had to think about that. Because unlike Michael,
Yeah.
I'm the religious half of the politics guys for sure. Over the break, a colleague of mine for Christmas had got me a book called The Storm Before the Storm. I don't know if you've heard of Mike Duncan before, Michael, but he's actually a ancient history podcaster
Hmm.
who focuses on the Roman era. And this is way outside my normal kind of stuff, but I'm going to recommend it because it was a really interesting read. He got it for me because I tend to do American history and biography, and then with a good healthy dose of England thrown in. But I don't get out of that niche too often. And so he said I need to do something Roman. And so one day Amazon showed up and he had purchased this for me. It's a really fascinating book. And if you're interested at all in Roman history, it's a worthwhile read. But what's really fascinating, and you can actually get it online, and this is what I'll be linking to for my reading, is his preface is basically an argument about how we can use Rome to think about the United States. So I'm actually going to be putting a link both to the book, if you're interested in larger go, and to his podcast with his kind of his preface there about that connection, if you're interested in a different way of analyzing U.S. policy. And so it was just very interesting on that front, the storm before the storm.
Cool. That sounds great. I'm definitely going to check that out.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all
I
for
guess.
this week.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We really do appreciate you tuning into this is our first 2018 show. So
That's right.
plenty more to come. So we hope you like what you heard and that you will check out today's sponsor, Policy Genius. You can do the financially responsible thing and compare quotes on life insurance and more for free with Policy Genius at policygenius.com. And, as I mentioned, one thing that's going to happen in 2018 is very shortly, in fact, in early February, we're going to move to a completely ad-free format. And so that means listener support is going to be more important to us than ever. And so if you'd like to help us out, go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links there. You will find there. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can share this episode with your friends and followers or pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. And also leaving reviews and ratings in iTunes really does help. And hey, if you've got a question, comment, just want to get in touch with us, you can do that at mail@politicsguys.com or on our Facebook page where you can message us and where we post stuff throughout the week, like Trey's great article on religion. And there was a lot of, as he mentioned, a lot of really interesting listener comments on that. And that's always great to see. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Trey Orndorff. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.